Hi everybody, welcome to the final part of my Beatles and Solo Ultimate Album Ranking Series. It's been about 6 months now I've been doing this, since I did a Paul McCartney album ranking list, and I thought, I wonder if I could throw John, George and Ringo's albums into the mix. Maybe I could even put the Beatles in there as well. Well, this is that final part. If you've not seen the previous parts and you want to do that first, then there'll be links all around, comments, descriptions, etc., where you can go and have a look at those if you want to first. But I've got 13 Beatles albums here. The UK Beatles albums that I'm going to put into the mix. For the purposes of this, I'm regarding Magical Mystery Tour as a proper album. I know there's some debate over that, but I'm regarding it as such for the purposes of this. So let's go with Please Please Me. I'm going to go forwards chronologically here. Please Please Me will kick off the ranking sort of in its own place, and then we'll fit the others around it as we go through. Please Please Me, released in 1963, the Beatles' first album. And what a great start. It's not exactly the album that George Martin planned at first. He was hoping to do a live album from the cavern, but then logistically he realised that it was going to be too noisy. There was too much condensation in the cavern, just wasn't going to work. So the Beatles did most of the album in a mammoth one-day session, as I'm sure you know, apart from the songs that had already been released as singles. So Love Me Do, P.S. I Love You, Please Please Me and Ask Me Why had already been recorded in 1962, but they're the versions that appear on this album. So it was very much kind of designed to be a kind of, here's what you might expect to see the Beatles do in a live show. And it works absolutely fantastically as that. It's an album that I absolutely adore. Certainly more than some of the albums that follow it. It's just always been an absolute favourite of mine. So any album that beats Please Please Me in this ranking is certainly doing very well as far as I'm concerned. So it's going in its own place at the start of the rankings. And then we go to With the Beatles. Recorded sort of from late summer through to early autumn of 1963. By this point, they'd had a couple of number one singles in the UK. They'd taken the UK pretty much by storm. They were the number one band, and they were doing really well across Europe. Not really much at all happening in the USA still, but of course that was to come not soon afterwards. This is a really interesting album, I think, where it's the energy of it. The energy just absolutely shines through from the moment that It Won't Be Long kicks in at the start. It's just bang, it just smacks you in the face. They're still relying heavily on cover versions at this point. There's quite a few on here. But the great cover versions, Please Mr. Postman, Roll Over Beethoven, Devil in a Heart, Money at the End, they're great cover versions. And Lennon and McCartney starting to really sort of evolve as songwriters on here as well. So it's a really great album, and I love the energy of it. You can tell that there's the confidence that the Beatles have got from their early hits. The one thing with this album, though, is, and this will be just my opinion, I'm sure other people are going to disagree, there are 3 of my least favourite Beatles songs on this album. And that is Little Child, Not a Second Time, and Hold Me Tight. Any complaints, please put in writing to my home address. Thank you very much. Or in the comments down below. But they are, some if you're going to have favourites, that automatically means that some songs aren't going to be your favourites, and those are 3 of mine that I've just never really liked. So, in terms of enjoyment, although I can't deny what an absolutely brilliant album that is, I think I probably enjoy Please Please Me a little more. I'm really interested in that kind of really early 60s and 1962 era of the Beatles, and that just kind of helps it for me. So, With the Beatles at the moment goes in second place. Moving on to the first half of 1964 now. The Beatles are conquering America. They are conquering the whole damn world by now. And A Hard Day's Night, obviously, of course, the album made to go alongside their first movie, is made. And by this point, when they're making this album, they've got such confidence. Confidence of knowing that they are the best band on the planet by this point. And the songwriting's starting to mature as well. So Hard Day's Night, fantastic. That opening chord itself is worthy of so much discussion about how the heck that was put together. But when you've got songs such as I'll Be Back, and Things We Said Today, And I Love Her, Can't Buy Me Love, I Should Have Known Better, If I Fell. I mean, these are just quality songs all the way through. They knew what they had. They had something special, and they were really bringing it into the records. So it's a fantastic album, and I would be kidding myself if I didn't put it into first place at the moment. A very interesting album next. Beatles for Sale from the back end of 1964. I just think it's a miracle that this album even exists. It's probably fair to say that no band in history has ever had a year quite like the Beatles had in 1964. In terms of the success, the adulation, the intensity, the work rate, absolutely phenomenal. And they decided to cap it off at the end of the year by, let's just make another album. So there are certain signs on this album that maybe they're a little bit tired, but it's still absolutely packed with great songs. I think where it does lack here a little bit, compared to the previous albums, is in some of the cover versions. I don't think they're quite as inspired. You're not quite going to find something that hits the heights of, say, a Twist and Shout or a Money here, although rock and roll music comes damn close. But they're starting to evolve as songwriters a little bit by this point. Things like No Reply, I'm a Loser, are really sort of starting to show the direction that they might go in over the next year or so, and certainly evolve over the next year or so. So those songs are kind of like almost like a Baby Rubber Soul, if you like. But what I would say in absolute favour of this album is, if I was doing a ranking that was just purely based on vocal harmonies, this might be the best album they ever made in terms of that. Listen to some of the harmonies on things like Babies in Black, for example. Just absolutely stunning. It's a beautiful harmonies album. It's got great Lennon and McCartney songs such as I'll Follow the Sun, for example, but overall it just doesn't quite hit the heights of the previous three, and I think that has to be something to do with the workload that they'd had for a long time by this point. So Beatles for Sale, I don't think I can put it higher than the three that have preceded it, so I have to put it in fourth place at the moment. There's no letting up for the Beatles as they enter 1965. Just another 2 albums and another 2 movies and a world tour. They kicked it all off with Help, of course, to go along with their second movie. And for a long time, I kind of thought of this as pretty much the perfect pop album. There are very few pop albums, I think, that have ever beaten this one. Help is, again, it's showing a progression in songwriting there. You're moving away from just kind of love songs, but it's starting to songs that are to do with sort of how you're feeling and sort of crying out for help, and sort of showing a little bit about your mental state there. Paul McCartney's certainly starting to blossom as a songwriter with songs like The Night Before, and of course Yesterday, I've Just Seen a Face, etc. Just absolutely phenomenal songs. He's really blossoming by this point. Ticket to Ride is another leap forward for the Beatles in terms of their songwriting and their song making, if you like. And I love Ringo's contribution of Act Naturally, the Buck Owens song that wasn't that old when they recorded it, but for me it's just one of the most enjoyable highlights of the album. George is starting to come up with more hit songs as well now, so we've got I Need You and You Like Me Too Much on here that are starting to get him into the groove of trying to compete alongside Lennon and McCartney. He would certainly do that later on, but he's lagging behind a little bit at this point, but he's certainly getting there. So it's a fantastic pop album, and I think it's a cut above what they'd done so far up to this point. So you can't fail to enjoy this album. I have to put it in first place at the moment. We then come to the back end of 1965. Again, like Beatles for Sale a year earlier, they'd had the most ridiculously busy year, making movies, making albums, going out on world tours, but they needed to put out an album before Christmas. So this was kind of a last minute thing at the end of the year to get this out and ready in the shops. But my God, what an absolutely stunning album, especially the mono version. They're really now not just at the top of the game commercially, but they are by far the best songwriters in the world at this moment in time. I believe anyway. People like Brian Wilson are certainly giving them a run for the money, and it's a really interesting battle that they're starting to have with Brian. You know, he's pushing them onto greater heights, and then this pushes Brian to do Pet Sounds. That pushes the Beatles on with what they're doing with Revolver and Sgt Pepper. It's just an incredible battle that was going on there, but they're really blossoming. I keep saying they're blossoming as songwriters. They're doing it again. It's just leaps and bounds every album now. Drive My Car, Norwegian Wood, we've got George Harrison playing the sitar. He's starting to get involved in Indian music now. And again, it's pushing the music forward. It's breaking new barriers. Songs like Nowhere Man and In My Life show that John Lennon is really more than just a pop writer now. He's really starting to carve a niche for himself as a new kind of pop that really everybody's trying to follow. It's probably not quite as much of a leap forward for Paul McCartney, I don't think, on this album, even though his contributions are great, like Drive My Car and Michelle, You Won't See Me. But in terms of the leaps that he had been making and he's about to make again, this doesn't push him on in quite the same way that the other albums do, but still great contributions. George's If I Needed Someone is by far, I think, the best thing he's done up until this point. And these are just four men who absolutely rule the world now, and have been doing for a good sort of couple of years or so. So I have to put Rubber Soul in first place. And this is the point of the video where I realise that my copy of Revolver that should be in that box is actually up on the wall there. But I've not brought that copy down. I've brought this copy down off the wall that was sat there. This, I realised recently, I'd never really thought about it before, this is the first Beatles record I ever bought. This very copy here. This was a 1980s repress of Revolver that I bought in June of 1989. So very special memories for me has this album. But Revolver itself, well, we're right in the thick of Revolver at the moment. As I record this, we're a couple of weeks away from the release of the Revolver Super Deluxe. So very excited about that. But this album, oh God, it's just ridiculous the fact that I'm saying this again after having said it about the previous few albums. It's a massive leap forward. Again, it really is. Again, it's George's best album. Taxman, Love You Too, I Want to Tell You. He's really starting to rock now, is George. Paul McCartney, as I said before, he'd kind of not done the massive leap on Rubber Soul that he'd done earlier, but he's done it again here. If we pick out Paul's songs on here, Eleanor Rigby, Here, There and Everywhere, his contributions to Yellow Submarine, of course, Good Day Sunshine, For No One, Got to Get You Into My Life. Absolutely incredible. I would say this is the start of the period that was probably for a good maybe 3 years where Paul McCartney was, I would say, the greatest songwriter on the planet. Other opinions are available, of course, ladies and gentlemen. But let's not forget what John Lennon was doing at this point, because you've got the magnificent She Said, of course, I'm Only Sleeping, and Your Bird Can Sing, Dr. Robert, but Tomorrow Never Knows at the end. Wow. I've done sort of chronological listens before of pulling together sort of hundreds of songs and dozens of albums that I've listened to over a period of about a month. That's all chronological from the birth of rock and roll right through to the end of the 60s. And when Tomorrow Never Knows comes on, it's one of those wow moments where you think, nothing like this has ever happened before. It still sounds futuristic to this day, 56 years later. It's incredible. It's astonishing. Despite the highs that they'd hit with the previous few albums, Revolver just blows it all apart. And again, their latest album, as it stands currently, comes in and knocks all the others off the number one spot. 1967. Wow, that was a year for the Beatles. Sgt Pepper's Lonely Take two. Sgt Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, they started recording it in late 1966, and it just went on for what at the time was an incredible length of time. They didn't get it finished until sort of several months later, and there are very few albums that can change society and change the world that you live in. This is one of them. You know, there's been quite a few albums that have changed music and moved music forward, but this changed a good swathe of society back then. As far as I'm concerned, and I've said this often, that this is my favourite album of all time. just no question about it. It's just a stunning achievement what they did, and what's not only what the Beatles did, but what the team, George Martin, Geoff Emerick, and any other engineers involved did on this album. It's just astonishing with the 4-track recording that they had at the disposal. It's borderline genius what they did here. Just incredible songs. Sgt Pepper, with a little help from my friends, that great intro that makes you sort of think it's going to be a concept album, but that concept kind of disappears and just comes back a little bit at the end. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, getting better. It's an underrated Beatles song, but it's probably been one of my favourite Beatles songs forever as Getting Better. Fixing a Hole, conversely, is one that I've never been that bothered about. Yes, it's still my favourite album of all time, but Fixing a Hole for me is just the one point where I just maybe lose concentration for a couple of minutes. Paul's really cooking with She's Leaving Home. This is, again, it's probably another step forward for him as a songwriter. But it's just amazing all the way through. Within You Without You by George is, again, he's just fully embracing his love for Indian music at this point, and it's another leap forward for George. In the deluxe Sgt Pepper box, you get to hear George teaching the Indian musicians how he wants it to go. And for somebody who, at that point, he was only just sort of kind of just hitting his 24th birthday when Sgt Pepper was being made, for somebody to be able to conduct experienced Indian musicians like that, just absolutely superb. And it builds great towards the end, and of course we've got the magnificent A Day in the Life at the end, just one of the most astonishing pieces of music ever made. So there's no surprise after what I've said that this is racing up to number 1 in the chart so far. So the last 4 Beatles albums that we've looked at, I've put them all in at number 1 ahead of everything that's come before. Can Magical Mystery Tour continue that run? So yes, I am including Magical Mystery Tour. I know it wasn't an official album at the time, but it's kind of regarded as part of the Beatles canon now, so I am including this. So it's a very interesting mixture of songs that had already been released on singles, such as Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane. It's got singles on there, B-sides like Baby You're a Rich Man, plus of course coupled with the various songs from the Magical Mystery Tour movie. Now, if I'm going to put on one of the Beatles films, there's a good chance, very good chance, it's going to be Magical Mystery Tour. It's the one that I'm most often in the mood for. I really love it. It's completely mental, don't really understand what's going on, but I love it. The songs on here are absolutely fantastic. In terms of, if you were doing a sort of an individual ranking of each song, the quality of each song, then this may well beat every other Beatles album. But I'm looking at the albums as a whole. And although it's wonderful, it's fantastic, I probably rank some of the albums that actually were proper official studio albums at the time a bit higher than this in terms of enjoyment. So, as wonderful as it is, and the quality of the songs is stunning, Magical Mystery Tour at the moment is going into 4th place. We then have the last album that was part of this mono box, although I've still got the others kept in there. There's room for them. The White Album, the Beatles, to give it its full title, from 1968. The mammoth double album with the songs that when they were out in Rishikesh in India in early 1968, they were writing loads of songs. They came back, they demoed them at George's house, the wonderful Isha demos, and then they went and recorded this phenomenal double album. It's sprawling, it's all over the place, it's just got so many different styles in it. And that's one of the main reasons why I've always said, that kind of mythical question about you're going to be stranded on a desert island for the rest of your life. Somehow, and it's never explained how, it's got electric, it's got a record player, and you can take one album with you. What are you going to take? I'm going to take the White Album because it covers so many styles. It's going to kind of, whatever mood I'm in, it's probably covered on the White Album. I got to know this album back in 1989, just after I bought that copy of Revolver, and I was really starting to get to know the Beatles albums for the first time. And it was, for somebody like me who knew Revolver and I knew Sgt Pepper and I knew a bit of Rubber Soul and Help at the time, it was like, what the heck is this? What's going on here? The songs like Piggies and Happiness is a Warm Gun were just were just incredible to me because they were so different to what I was used to. And it's an album that's I've never stopped loving it. The last third of this album, I think, should roughly from sort of long onwards, should really take you to a dark place, and ending with what I think is the magnificent Revolution 9. It just wouldn't be the White Album without it. It's crazy, it's bonkers, it makes no sense at all, but it's fantastic. I think I just said something similar about Magical Mystery Tour, didn't I? But I love it, and then the way that it just kind of goes all traditional afterwards with Ringo coming in on Good Night with the strings and everything. Perfect end to an album. So it's not the easiest decision here to rank this and Sgt Pepper. I've already said Sgt Pepper is my favourite album of all time, and there's no question about that. I'm looking here at enjoyment, and I think this gives it a very, very close run for its money. There's so little in it. But Sgt Pepper is just holding on to the top spot, and I'm putting the White Album just misses out in second place at the moment. We then have Yellow Submarine, the soundtrack album, and you could argue that it's not actually a proper official Beatles album, but it is, so that's why it's here. Of course, you've got Side B, which is all the George Martin orchestral stuff from the Yellow Submarine movie, which I do enjoy listening to that. It's not very often that I'm going to pull this album out and listen to the whole thing all the way through. It's quite a rarity for me to do that. But I'm going to enjoy the whole lot, start to finish. And it's got Side A, of course, starts with Yellow Submarine, finishes with All You Need Is Love. So 2 songs that had been around for quite a long time at that point. But then sandwiched in there is 4 songs. Only a Northern Song, All Together Now, Hey Bulldog, It's All Too Much. Now, Only a Northern Song is good. It was recorded during the Sgt Pepper sessions. It could have ended up on Sgt Pepper, but didn't. It found its home here eventually. And All Together Now used very well at the end of the Yellow Submarine film. And they're 2 perfectly fine, decent, good Beatles songs. But then Hey Bulldog and It's All Too Much. Magnificent. Absolutely superb. I adore both of those songs. And if it wasn't for those 2 songs, I think this would definitely be down at the bottom of the list by some considerable margin. I think overall I still have to put it at the bottom. I think I can't argue that I enjoy this album more than any of the others. But I would certainly like to pick out the fact that Hey Bulldog and It's All Too Much are 2 absolute favourites of mine. But this has to go in 11th and last place at the moment. So we have 2 albums left, and I'm probably going to really annoy some people now with the order that I'm going to do them in. I'm going to do Let It Be first. Let It Be, to me, always comes before Abbey Road. I know it was released after. I know there's little bits of this that were recorded after Abbey Road had already been released. But to me, it's Let It Be, then it's Abbey Road. Anyway, what do I think of this album? Well, certainly I would say that since last year, when obviously this had its massive moment in the sun with the release of the big box set and it obviously been tied in with Peter Jackson's Get Back movie, it's really elevated this album. I think I would have had this very low down the list before. Not that I don't love it. And this is the thing with Beatles albums. With pretty much any other band, if you put something in, let's say, 10th or 11th place, probably means that, it's not that good. But with the Beatles, even something that's in 11th place is going to be absolutely phenomenal. It's their own fault for being too good and just making too many fantastic albums. But anyway, Let It Be, 2 of Us at the start, I think is a fantastic opening. It's one of the kind of final swan songs of John and Paul together, really sort of close harmonising and making it feel like a joint performance of the 2 of them. I'm not that fussed about Dig a Pony, never have been, and the same with Dig It, although it's kind of a nothing song. Across the Universe feels a little bit out of place on here because it was nothing really to do with January 1969. All right, they sort of played around with it a couple of times, and that's why it ended up in the movie, and that's why it had to end up on the album. But in effect, it's an early 1968 song, so it always feels a little bit out of place, but it's magnificent anyway. Let It Be, well, of course it's a classic. I've Got a Feeling is one of my favourite Beatles songs. and particularly the version that's on this album. We've had a few versions over the years, but it's to me it's just an extraordinary song. I love it, and getting to see it in such good quality performed on that rooftop has just made me love it even more. And I think it's a fantastic B-side to this. So I've got a feeling, One After 909, again, seeing John and Paul up on that roof, having the energy that they had in the very early 60s, but having that up on that rooftop and putting it into one of their early songs, it's just an absolutely joyful song, and I adore it. The Long and Winding Road, okay, Phil Spector went completely overboard with it, but it's still great. For You Blue, a really good bluesy George song, which I've always really enjoyed. So that's certainly going to be a great George contribution on the album. And of course the classic Get Back at the end. So it's a fantastic album, and it's really over the last year or so that I've come to appreciate that more than I had done previously. So where's it going to go? Well, I'm putting this at the moment in 5th place. We have one more album to go, but don't forget, once I've finished this ranking, I'm going to throw it into that massive list of John, Paul, George and Ringo albums that I built in previous videos, and we're going to see where this ranking that's building up fits in with all that. So we have Abbey Road from 1969. The final time that the 4 Beatles came together to make an album, and it's kind of incredible that they did, really, with all the business woes that had been going on during 1969, and it might have all ended after the January 69 sessions, but they came back and did an album, as George Martin said, will you let me produce it the way that I used to do? They all said yes, and he said, well, okay, let's do it then. And it's just a magnificent swan song. Side 1 is a collection of great songs. You can decide yourself whether Maxwell's Silver Hammer fits in that category or not, but it wouldn't be Abbey Road without Maxwell's Silver Hammer, would it? But it gets off to great John start and end. Come Together and I Want You, She's So Heavy at the beginning and end of side 1 is a great opening and closing to that side. And then we have side 2. Side 2 of Abbey Road, just those 5 words, side 2 of Abbey Road, is going to conjure up things in Beatles fans' brains, and it certainly does for me as well. I suppose it's difficult to say exactly where the medley starts, because it sort of threatens to start and then backs off a bit and then fully comes in. But really from Because onwards, it's just, to me, side 2 of Abbey Road is probably the greatest thing that's ever been put onto vinyl. It's just astonishing what they came up with. And as well, after all the things that they'd been through over the past kind of 18 months where it had threatened to fall apart on various occasions, for them to come back and do that, it's just astonishing. We got to hear the original intended order of the medley in the Abbey Road box set about 3 years ago. That was interesting. With they had Her Majesty in between Mean Mr Mustard and Polythene Pam. And I don't think that really worked at all. I think it was a great decision to pull Her Majesty out. And of course, it was, as the famous story goes, it was just kind of stuck on the end because the engineer had been told, you don't throw anything of the Beatles away. So he'd kind of just stuck it on the end. And then when they heard the playback and it suddenly went, ping, Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl. Oh yeah, we like that. We'll have that. It's just genius. It's one of the great albums of all time. But then again, so are several of the Beatles albums. So where's this going to go? Well, I could make a case for this being the greatest album of all time. I could make a case for there being half a dozen Beatles albums better and more enjoyable than it. It's so difficult to place this. But place it I have, and I have decided to put this in 4th place. So behind Sgt Pepper, The White Album and Revolver. So that was not an easy decision at all, but I'm comfortable with it. They just made so many great albums. I've now got the full ranking here, so I'm going to slot those Beatles albums into the John, Paul, George, Ringo album ranking that I've built up so far, and this is going to be it, the final 110 album ranking list. If you can find a bigger Beatles related album ranking on the internet anywhere, let me know. Good luck with that. So it's no surprise that the Beatles albums are going to be up towards the top of the list. You know, that's just accepted. But what I'm really interested in with this ranking, when I was putting it together, was how would the top solo albums fare against the top Beatles albums? So we've already seen that my top solo albums were things like Ram, All Things Must Pass, Imagine, Band on the Run, that kind of thing. How are they going to compare with the Beatles albums? So, fitting the Beatles albums in the order in which we did. So last place was Yellow Submarine. I thought about this long and hard where to put this, and I finally settled on a place that I feel comfortable with. Remember, this is in terms of my enjoyment of the album. And it just misses out on the top 40. So it's in 41st place, Yellow Submarine. I've put it just behind London Town and Press to Play. I think I would be kidding myself if I said I enjoyed Yellow Submarine more than either of those two albums. We then have quite a jump up. We go through various albums by all four Beatles, actually, before we get to the next album, Beatles for Sale, which I've put in 26th place, just above Red Rose Speedway and just behind George's Living in the Material World. We've then got several more albums of mainly Paul and John. Before we've got a little group here of 4 Beatles albums that I've put together, and these are ones that are just these are all in the top 20 now. So with the Beatles, Please Please Me, Hard Day's Night and Help are all inside the top 20, with Help being in 15th place. But then above that, I thought I can't really personally say that I would enjoy any of those albums more than I would enjoy Flaming Pie. And I'm not going to apologise for that. I'm very much one of the people who doesn't believe the common conception that none of the Beatles made anything as good afterwards as what they made with the Beatles. I think obviously the Beatles stuff was the best, but I think on various occasions they made stuff outside of the Beatles that stands above a lot of Beatles output, and I'm not going to apologise for that. I've then put Magical Mystery Tour in 13th, just below McCartney. And I expected Plastic Ono Band to finish top 10, but it's just missed out. It's in 11th place. It has just missed out. I ummed and ahed about Let It Be and Plastic Ono Band. And in the end, it's purely because I've gone with this word enjoyment. Plastic Ono Band is a phenomenal album. Absolutely stunning. But sometimes the subject matter, it can be a little bit more challenging rather than enjoyable. I'm not saying it's not enjoyable, because it really is. But sometimes enjoyment isn't the key word you associate with Plastic Ono Band. Whereas on Let It Be, with songs like One After 909 and I've Got a Feeling, it's just pure enjoyment for me. So I think I can justify having Let It Be in 10th place there. We then go up to Band on the Run. And then just above that, we have Rubber Soul in 8th place. Again, this is so close because they're just all fantastic albums. Rubber Soul is sitting behind Imagine, All Things Must Pass and Ram. Now, those of you that have been paying attention during this series of videos will know that Ram was my number 1 Beatles solo album. So that means that with it being in 5th place, the top 4 spots are occupied by the Beatles, with Sgt Pepper, White Album, Revolver and Abbey Road. So I also noticed that from the top 14, 7 of them are Beatles solo albums. So half of the top 14 is solo albums, which I think is a credit to the members of the band who made those albums. So that is my final 110 album ranking list. But as I did in the last video, I've been doing some average placings just to see where on average albums by each of these sit. And again, I've done 2 different versions of this. So taking into account every single album in this list, the Beatles of course have the highest average placing. On average, their albums sit in 13th place. Way better than next place, which is Paul, in 54.8. So there's a massive difference. But what I've also done, like I did last time, I've done another version where I've stripped out all the live albums, classical albums, experimental albums, and I've just left the regular studio albums. And it's narrowed the gap certainly, but here is the final the final tally for that. Again, the Beatles 13. John Lennon actually has got an average of 34th place for that, well ahead of Paul on 44, George on 50, Ringo in 77th place. So there is my final ranking list that's taken 6 months to do. It's been a right task, it really has. I hope you've enjoyed watching it all. I've enjoyed reading all your comments and people getting unnecessarily annoyed with some of my decisions. It's just my opinion. Your opinion is equally as valid. But still let me have it down in the comments. I don't mind. I can take it. I've got some other things to go and do now that I've finished this series. I hope you'll join me for them. I've got various ideas of where I want to go next, and they'll be coming up very soon. But of course, we are almost on to Revolver time now. If you're watching this within any sort of timescale of it going out live. It's coming up very soon. I'm going to be all over that with unboxings, reviews. I'll be doing live listening parties that you can join me on, where we all listen to it together and chat about the album in real time. I hope you'll join me for that. If you haven't done already, hit the subscribe button. You are much more likely to get told by YouTube when I've got new videos out if you do that. So let me know your comments down below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye-bye.